We're officially live.
Good afternoon. I'm Senator Julie Rosen and co-chair of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. My other co-chair, my partner, is off doing some kind of rally. So I was hoping that we could get a live version of him speaking to a large crowd, but apparently he'll be back. So I'm pinch hitting here, and I want to welcome you to actually one of the last meetings that we're supposed to have before our report is due on this Tuesday, February 1st. But it looks like, and we will talk about this later, that we will be having a couple more meetings to review some of we'll review the entire proposed policy options that were sent this afternoon. It's quite lengthy. I think it's about 12 or 13 pages long. And the delivery systems work group also has their work all printed up. And so there's a lot to review. We will be sending this report to the governor and to the chairs of the appropriate committees in the Senate and the House, but it will just be just the findings for the executive order request of what they have found. And hopefully you all have this in front of you. I think we will be posting it up. And I believe Kevin Reese is not available yet, so he's probably working up the crowd pretty good right now. Michelle or Grace, who would like to take over? We have a pretty detailed day in front of us, and we go to 4:30. We have testifiers, but I believe the plan is to go through these proposed policy options. So thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. And welcome to the council meeting today, everyone. If you missed the early announcement, we would love to see everyone's faces today as we have more of a conversation-based meeting around the policy options that I sent over. We want to make sure that we hear from folks and you have a chance to weigh in. A couple of just kind of precursor thoughts. We sent around a draft to the council, and the working group also received the same draft. But the part that feels important is, as we're looking at these policy options, we're really introducing them today as something to chew on, something to have additional meetings about, something to talk to your constituents about. We'll be lining up additional public testimony and making sure that you're hearing from working group members. Or if you have questions about how we're really trying to approach some systemic community corrections changes, that these are the places to bring them up and talk about them. So while a report is due on February 1st, we can make changes to that report before February 1st as a CSG Justice Center team. Hi, Director Reese. And we will have time between now and when legislation is introduced or when statutes need to be developed to make additional addendums. As long as we're tracking the process and being really transparent, I think we're good to do so. Senator Rosen? No? Okay. I just want to make sure, I thought maybe you were jumping in to call out that Director Reese joined us. Director Reese, welcome. Did you want to add anything?
Welcome. Yeah, thank y'all so much. Sorry for being late. I'm coming live from the Rondo Library. I'm actually doing a press conference. Someone is close to our community that lost their mom to violence in Minneapolis a week or so ago. So public safety matters to all of us. And can't get too much into details, but there was a mental health issue, right? There was someone who was asking for help and they didn't get the help that they were asking for. And the ripple effect, a brother of mine lost his mom. So I want to send love throughout the four corners of Minnesota for Tina McCombs.
Thanks, Director Reese. And thank you. With that in mind, that's a nice bridge to talk about public safety, but I also think that if I can represent what all the hundreds of conversations with folks across Minnesota have told me, is that you all are passionate and care a lot about this issue for deeply personal reasons, but also just for the general improvement of the Minnesota community. So thank you again for your time and energy. One of our colleagues at the Department of Corrections she did a nice reframing for me yesterday, which is a lot of times we're asked to make public safety and big decisions without even a series of 4 2-hour meetings or 5 2-hour meetings. So in some ways, it's a luxury to have some time to chew on this. And we always wish we had more time. So as much as our team can be available, as much as we can help you digest, give input, feel comfortable with, talk to your constituents, we are here and happy to do what we can. So nice to see your faces today. And if it's all right with you all, we're gonna do a facilitated conversation. Hopefully you have a document in front of you. I'd rather see your faces than share the screen. And then Ruby, I know our team is making sure that people who are tuning in over the live feed can have access to the document or get it. So just as a reminder, what we did, we have a research team at our division. We have an assessment team in our division that has talked to people across the state of Minnesota, right? We did a comprehensive more than 80 meeting assessment. We looked at just like how many data? Millions of datas? All the datas?
We looked at a lot of data records, but more importantly, we looked back at many years of data. So not just the most recent year, but going back to, depending on the data set, quite a few years of data.
Thanks, Jess. So as we talk about these policy options, we just want to make sure that everyone knows this is grounded in this process and connected directly to some trends that we've seen, some people that we've talked to along the way. And that's kind of how GRI works, right? So a couple of things, and we talked about these over the mirage. Is it a mirage, like the barrage of slides that you've gotten? Am I freezing, Jack, or can everyone hear me? Okay. Because I can switch if I need to. But just a couple of reminders of some key points that you've seen in some slides, which is Minnesota spends the lowest amount on corrections. And yes, part of this is due to the lack of investment in prisons, but this gives us some room to think about how the corrections money as Minnesota is being spent and what the priorities are. This also tells us about, if you remember and think back, there's wide variation across the state and how much counties contribute to corrections and how much the state is contributing to corrections. And when we're considering some of those broader public safety issues, whether it's recidivism, whether it's reconviction, whether it's rearrest, when we're looking at the comparisons by county, when we're measuring the success of outcomes, we really want to see things a little bit closer together across the state. Members of our team spent a while really looking at how other states invest in their supervision system. And in the document provided, Carl shared some examples from Oregon, Texas, Kansas, Pennsylvania. And we did get a chance through this process to hear from your peers in Oregon, kind of about the nuts and bolts of how they did ultimately a similar process that you all did, which is how do you move from one way of funding services to a more sustainable, predictable way of funding. Carl, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Grace. Good to see you all. I'm happy to be with you, and I'm on page 2 of the document that Grace sent out. That's titled Policy Option 1 Details. There are 5 bullets on the page, and even though they're not numbered, I'll try to say a number as I touch on each one briefly. First, we see the opportunity and the imperative really to come up with a single funding mechanism for all counties in Minnesota. We have Grace alluded to Oregon, and I've certainly looked to them and thought about their system quite a bit. And I think that Minnesota can and should do a rigorous workload study along the same lines as what they do. And that would result in a computation of the per diem cost of providing supervision for different populations with different characteristics. We think it's important to note that new method of funding and new commitment by the state to funding shouldn't replace current investments that are in place from local governments and tribes. Everyone needs to kind of stick and stay where they are at a minimum so that the system truly does become better resourced. In order to develop that formula, point 2, we envision a Justice Reinvestment Implementation Committee. This is a very typical structure for a Justice Reinvestment project to move from phase 1 of adopting policies to phase 2 implementation, and having a working group that we work with and that perhaps other consultants are working with to implement all the different policies that the legislature adopts and that people have agreed on. And again, this job one for that group would be coming up with this workload study methodology and accounting for people of different offense levels, different risk and need levels, et cetera. And then that study should be the basis for the budgeting for supervision across both the state and local agencies. Number three, we want to tie an influx in state commitment to this system to a commitment by everybody to implement the recommendations that we're coming up with. There's a lot of things that Minnesota can add to its system, that can do to stitch it together more comprehensively and more equitably. And everyone needs to kind of pull their weight in doing those things and see this as a real movement, a real change in what's going on because of the state's increased support and the state's expectation that there are going to be increases in positive outcomes for people on supervision, and again, sustained investment by local governments. Number four, in addition to a basic formulaic approach to funding, there should be an opportunity to create a separate pot of money, essentially, that would be used for some kind of an incentive program, a targeted innovation program that would be available to reward particular new approaches at the local level, new innovations that are new to the people in that agency, that would be used to incentivize appropriate outcomes and new approaches to increasing the success of people on supervision. And we see that as potentially subsuming some of the one-off type things that the state is currently funding in particular line items that would provide sort of a bucket of funding that would take care of those sorts of approaches and give more flexibility down the road. And then finally, we have kind of set aside the topic of pretrial supervision in terms of funding from the state. It's been stated multiple times in our conversations around in the last year or two that the pretrial issue is one where the state has not dictated what's happening at the local level, and made the point that as long as the state is not constraining pretrial release and supervision, that the state probably shouldn't be funding it, and that can be left to local prerogative. And so we're pretty much adopting that position that funding for local approaches to pretrial supervision should be local funding, unless and until the state comes up with some policy making around instances for which pretrial supervision is required. I will stop there and see if anyone has questions or comments.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, Senator Marty. Oh, you're still there.
Sorry. Just real briefly on the third bullet, one comment about, the last sentence, state funding increase should include human service expenditures. I think the probation officer from Roseau County mentioned again how, and Hennepin County as well, mentioned how like a lot of the mental health services just aren't available for people who need it. And I think we ought to highlight that part of that when we're talking about how we allocate funding. That may be not Department of Corrections funding, but it certainly needs a serious look when we do this, not just equalizing, but also making sure that it's not just the supervision, but the services that go along as well.
Thank you, Senator. And also recognizing that an investment into supervision isn't just actually like officer contact, right? It's that coordination, it's the building, all the pieces coming together. Absolutely. Thank you. Other comments, thoughts? Yeah, Kelly.
You would think I would figure this stuff out. I know I wasn't part of I didn't see the Oregon presentation, so I don't know how they did their workload study, but the one thing that strikes me is that maybe this is exactly what Senator Marty just said, but if we're trying to equalize service across the state, would the workloads reflect some practices that we don't want to encourage and others that we do. I mean, you know, so how does the workload factor into that issue as well? Workload study.
Great question, Kelly. I guess the way I see it factoring in is the potential to come up with different capitated rates for different populations and not reward, for example, the over supervision of people who don't really need either that much or any supervision, but as reflected in the capitated rates themselves, or even in the amount of time for which the rate would apply, so that they just wouldn't go on for years on end for particular populations.
Can I also add to that, Carl, that in the way we're imagining changing the formula, there's two parts to it. The one is a base investment into every county or tribe, and the second is the capitated rate. So what that gives you is it doesn't incentivize over supervision, right? Because every county knows they're going to have a certain amount of FTE invested, whether the service is provided by DOC or CCA or CPO. And then the additional investment is by capitated rate or population. So we support the capacity of the county to do the work in a responsive, localized way, and we support the investment of the people on supervision. Thanks, Kelly. Representative Moran?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I pretty much agree with what everyone has said, but I do want us to think about, as we look at the structure of what we're doing and the results of what we want, that we create a process where, you know, there's individuals who are supervising, you know, those who are on probation, and that we are doing our due diligence to create a process that eliminate biases. I think we just really need to keep that at the forefront and recognizing that it happens, and that we are really going to be diligent about creating a process that weed out that type of process as much as possible.
Thanks, Representative Moran. And that's actually a nice transition, unless folks have other comments about the initial thinking on the funding formula, into some of the supervision practices. But I want to pause and make sure, especially members of the working group, Commissioner Swanson, CJ, Jason, Commissioner Schnell, just if any of you want to weigh in before we move on to the next section. All right.
I think it's been what we've talked about through the discussions with the group. So,
Excuse me, Grace.
Yeah.
There is some comments there's some people that can't get in. Have we got everybody in?
I think we do now. I think the Montana,
Yep.
I think the Montana Institute threw us off a little bit with Jason, but I think we have Jason now. Thanks,
And
Senator.
And Dana Colatar?
I've contacted her through email. She's a testifier. She just wanted to stream it and was coordinating testifiers. So
Okay.
she's got the link.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Grace, I think Jack is raising his hand.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks, David. I appreciate that. This is not apples to apples, but I will kind of to what Senator Marty had to say, related to some of the services associated with probation or supervision. My non-apples to apples comparison would be for those of us that are familiar with out-of-home placement in counties. The price for out-of-home placement varies dramatically. And I'm talking about the difference between perhaps $1,000 a month and $20,000 a month. And I'm not making that up. So it depends on the services that are necessary for that particular kid. I would suggest the same would be true for folks under supervision, that the cost of supervising them and adding these other services is going to vary greatly. So I think that has to be taken into consideration when you look at what you're trying to do for these people. The costs are going to be widely different, in my opinion. So it seems to me that that has to be taken into consideration when we're dealing with all of this.
Absolutely, Commissioner. Thank you. And I think that's the idea of determining capitated rates by different population, both offense, risks, and needs, right? And I don't know if you have a finer point to put on that, Carl, but just offering. Okay. Any other comments or questions before I move to the next section?
Well, Grace, excuse me, Julie Rosen. We will be discussing, I see one of your policy options does deal with behavioral health. That needs to be really scrutinized about, and in sync with DHS, what they are doing with the mental health block grants to these counties.
Yes. Thank you, Senator. And I did reach out to DHS this week, made a couple of contacts, but if folks have particular connections, I would appreciate them. We want to make sure, not only just because of your request, Senator Rosen, but because it's essential to this project, to make sure that we're digging into that. So appreciate some help there. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, Kelly. Oh, I have you on mute still.
Again, you'd think I would learn. I might be going over something that you've talked about in a different forum, but did we ever see, or do you have information on the degree to which the supervision agency pays for services and whether any of those costs are borne by the person on supervision? I think that would also be important to this whole discussion.
It is important to this whole discussion. This issue has come up, I think, in a more concentrated way in the past couple of weeks, but it has been raised throughout the project. You will see in this policy option some conversation about this when we talk about the transfer of supervision responsibility. And that's our sort of dipping the toes in the way of how much we're charging people on supervision for supervision. When you see the report, there is going to be a section that talks about issues we didn't get to, but that are essential to unpack in the next 2 to 3 years, and fines and fees will be on that list. Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, Mr. Choi.
See, I just wanted to better understand there's a line there about, and someone had mentioned this before, I think it was Carl, you were talking about this, but limiting the investments around pretrial supervision and making that a local thing, maybe for this project. But I think it's really important if there's a way to communicate, because at the end of the day, this is something that's potentially legislators are going to think about. And I think in some of the conversations that I've been having recently about people who are coming back into the justice system, oftentimes we've got issues relative to pretrial supervision or reoffense, et cetera. So I think that just while we may not put that as a part of this, I don't want to lose sight of that, because and this kind of goes into the mental health issues and the Rule 20 gap issue that many policymakers have been now talking about for decades, but yet we still can't figure out some of these solutions. So I just want to make sure that the policymakers here don't lose sight of the fact that that is probably one of the most critical issues right now, I think, facing the criminal justice system, is what are we doing to make sure that we're getting the better outcomes around some of the repetitive behavior that oftentimes is a result of the inability, because we don't have a restoration of competency program anymore at the state level. And you told the locals that we're on our own. And so I think a lot of locals have been struggling with that, because there's an enormous gap that I think Kara Levin and other media sources have talked about. So that's just one issue on the adult side. And there's a bunch of other things that probably should be talked about on the youth side, but that's a different conversation. I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. CJ, did you change your mind?
Yes and no. Mr. Choi brought up the restoration of competency issue, which is one of the things I was going to touch on. I would also say that part of, I think, the decision to say, if the state imposes something related to pretrial, then the state should fund the thing related to pretrial. Some of the pretrial decision-making in various jurisdictions is really tied to controlling jail populations. And so that's a very specific local need. And I think that was part of the reason behind the distinction, and certainly something that we talked about in the work group as a reason behind the distinction. It's not to say that there's not a need for pretrial supervision in a variety of spaces. It's more about what's driving those decisions to supervise pretrial, and where are we and why are we using pretrial supervision as opposed to a detention decision. What are those alternatives, and what are the local characteristics or local desires related to those pretrial diversion or pretrial alternative spaces, I think is sort of where we framed that conversation.
Thank you, CJ. Jason.
Yeah, thank you. And my apologies for coming in late. I had every technology challenge ever. And so, but I'm here with my phone. So thank you. And again, I apologize. Yeah, the pretrial thing, we have discussed it. I guess, while I can appreciate the position of, well, if it becomes a statewide thing, then the state needs to fund it. Forgive me if I'm skeptical of the state's ability to do that or willingness to do that, coming from a delivery system who had a statute that said you're supposed to fund us at this level, and it's been 26 years since they've funded us even close to that level. So I'm more than a little skeptical of that, especially as Mr. Choi referenced. There's a lot going on around bail reform and a shift toward a reliance on pretrial supervision for the right clients. Not everybody who gets out needs to be supervised, of course not. But I have concerns about that as that process unfolds and heads into a likely direction. Then we see statewide disparity of what pretrial looks like, what pretrial is available, because how is it funded? And I can also appreciate that, yeah, those are local decisions that impact how many people are in your jail. So is everything we're talking about for community supervision. Our local services that determine how many people really are in our jail, and then subsequently into our prisons. So I know I might be a lonely voice in the darkness on this one, but I'm sad to see that it's being specifically carved out and said that's not what we're going to do and fund with this go around. So I've said my piece.
Thank you, Jason. David or Carl, do you have anything you want to point out before?
Well, I will say what occurred to me as Jason was talking is it does seem possible to me that a workload study could include the pretrial subpopulation. I did ask the folks in Oregon about that. I thought we might get into a conversation about that issue when we had the Oregon folks online with us a month or two ago. And it turned out that they said, we're actually struggling with that issue too. Pretrial is kind of a hot topic in Oregon as well, and they didn't have any great answers, unfortunately. But I'm all ears if we can figure out some other way to get at that. But we did hear in the working group meeting recently that I think it's the Competency Restoration Task Force is talking about coming up with judicial branch navigators, I think akin to the Bridges program in Colorado, which I'm a fan of. So I think there are some things happening in that space, and we just hope that it all kind of comes together where all the right topics are covered.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, Dr. Williams.
Might be a relatively minor point, but I'm both intrigued and troubled by the language around targeted innovation fund. Historically, that has often led to programs that privilege efficiency over the experience of people in community, and consistent with what Representative Moran shared earlier. I'd love if there was more specificity in that around who would be making those decisions, what voices would be represented there, and something that would privilege kind of the overarching philosophy of this committee with regard to justice reinvestment, rather than just the word innovation, which carries, again, those notions of efficiency as opposed to a true reimagination.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Williams. And I think not only, I think that would be an easy edit in terms of that's more in line with the spirit of it, which is how do you promote no stalemates in supervision practices, not just doing things because it's the way we've done them, but to your point, which is I hope we're looking at not the usual suspects and how communities stay safe and who's involved in supervision or reentry, right? in terms of housing services, community services and supports, peer-led services, right? Absolutely. And that's an easy edit to make and reflective of the conversations I believe in the working group and the purpose. So thank you. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to move to the next section because this is the part where as a reflection of things we've talked about, which is how do we sort of increase the standard, effective, and equitable practices of supervision across the state? How do we reduce some of the recidivism? And in Minnesota, we really focused on the recidivism of reconviction. How many people are reconvicted after they are on probation as the best way to sort of alleviate some of the variations between re-incarceration or another probation term. So reconviction was the metric. And we also looked at community agencies and David's work and assessment. As he talks through the details, I'm sure he'll integrate that. But like, how are we consistently using risk assessments to case plan? How are we validating or not validating risk assessments? Which risk assessment tools are we using? And then how are we making sure that as in a system, there are no redundancies or we're not duplicating supervision across when somebody might be on supervision by more than one agency? And how do we sort of streamline across an entire system, regardless of who was doing or responsible for the supervision, better efficiencies and better supervision practices from all the to steal Director Reese's phrase, from all the corners of Minnesota. So David, if you want to run through the policy options, that would be great.
Sure. Excuse me. Sure. Hi, folks. So in terms of really looking at these issues, there's a number of options that we're suggesting. And the first one is to develop statewide supervision standards and definitions across the systems. And this is I should say, a number of things that I will talk about today are being worked on. But they aren't, some of them stall, some of them have taken a long time. Some of them are actually even farther along, but people aren't following them. So there are variations in all of these different things. And so in every instance of something around some of my recommendations, we could find somewhere where it's going on. But what the goal of this discussion is, we want these to go on consistently everywhere in the state, regardless of where you are or what system you're in. And so one of the things that we'd really like to see happen is make sure that the supervision practices are based on the principles of effective intervention and what we know today, and that is followed consistently across the different systems and in the different counties. Also, we would like to see the development of a statewide incentives and sanctions grid, and I'll talk about that later a little bit more. But fundamentally, the goal here is to increase the success of people on supervision, to lower the number of technical violations, meaning non-new crime violations, and to lower the amount of new crime of people committing a new offense as they move forward. So when we talk about failure on supervision, failure is both the issue of technical or non-new crime and new crime. And both of those are things to be targeted. They can't be targeted simply by supervising more. They need to be targeted by having the right responses and the evidence-based responses. In order to do that, you have to start out knowing who they are. And knowing who they are means knowing what are the drivers of the criminal behavior. And knowing that means you need to have a good, validated risk and needs, what's called criminogenic risk and needs assessment tool. You also need behavioral health assessment, substance use assessment. Those are important as well. But fundamentally, what you need is a solid risk and needs assessment tool. So we're recommending that you either use the LSCMI, which many people are using now already across the state, but you need to then validate it on the state population. Or if you don't want to use that and you want to use a different tool or develop a tool, that can all be figured out. The key issue is, let's not have different tools used. Secondly, even when I look at the different places using the same tool, I've found that many places were using them differently, different choices about who they use them on, different choices about what sections of the tool they used. We need consistency. We need to be able to make sure that it's being used well. The other thing is that cutoffs for levels vary depending on where people are. So what we're really measuring is what the system can offer, not what the individual needs. that's a problem as well. And so there are a number of things that need to be modified and changed as we move forward with this. To be clear, there are other types of tools besides a risk and needs tool. There are tools for special populations, special needs, et cetera. We're not suggesting that those tools shouldn't exist or wouldn't continue to exist. What we're talking about here is let's have the same criminogenic risk and needs tool utilized across the state, validated in the state, and as opposed to just off the shelf, if you will. There was, to be fair, several years ago, a validation of this particular tool, the LSCMI, but it never really saw the light of day. And so for most folks, the reality of it is that they don't see that they have a validated tool. And even though it was several years ago, or rather, even though it was validated several years ago, frankly, it's time to do it again. The tool should be revalidated really every 5 years when you're looking at these types of risk and needs tool. The next piece in terms of looking at all of this is, now let's say we get that tool. The next thing is the results of that need to actually drive what you do. So it needs to drive the case plan. And what Minnesota is also working on is the development of formalized case planning. And we want to support that. What should happen? Results from the validated tool or tools, because you have different issues, and they feed to the case plan. And then the case plan components result from the results of the assessment, and you're measuring what you're doing with that individual. We want to measure whether or not we're being impactful or making a difference. In addition to that, one of the other things that Minnesota is working on, and we want to really promote, is statewide guidance on limiting the standard conditions that people have. Now, that doesn't mean that a judge cannot determine that there needs to be a special condition. There are always special conditions. But standard conditions are basically fundamentally the ones that everybody has to follow. And a lot of times what we find is that there are way more standard conditions that are really necessary because they don't relate to that individual's difficulty. And so in many states that we've been working in, there have been committees that have really said, let's figure out what are the absolute necessary ones we need for everybody. Let's limit that so that we aren't basically setting up people for failure by giving them too many or giving them ones that are irrelevant to their issues. And yes, when there are particular needs that have to happen, we have the ability to put those other ones on. The next piece has to do with the services that are provided being gender responsive and culturally appropriate and trauma informed. There are some of these going on in the state. It's not happening consistently. Part of that is that there is not a centralized ongoing training around these issues for folks. And to be clear, systems, agents, supervisors, they work hard to find the training and to get to different places and to do different things, but it's not consistent again. And so you find something here, you find something here, you go over here, maybe this person gets this, maybe they don't get that. That's not a way to have a system, right? It's a little like suggesting my doctor should just see what he can find and good luck. Bad plan. And so again, one of the things that we're talking about in terms of the training is to make sure that at a state level that is available to everybody. So that might be expanding the training academy. It might mean a collaboration between the different systems because different systems do have different training options. Again, the point is to get to that end result. At this point, we're not saying this is the way that you do that. There needs to be other conversation about that. And then last but not least, in this particular area, is really streamlining the process for people on probation to be supervised by a single agency, including limiting associated fines and fees. Again, we gave you an extreme example of somebody in 5 different systems. That was an extreme example, but I talked to many people in two different on probation in 2 different counties and or 2 different systems. And so that becomes problematic and confusing. You have different stipulations, you have different fines and fees, different lengths of supervision, different styles of supervision, in some cases, different levels of risk. Again, it's the same person. What's happening is that the person's being fit into the particular different categories of the different counties or systems, as opposed to being responsive to what that individual needs. And that's not out of bad intent. It's because things have been developed individually or unilaterally, and there's that lack of consistency between the different components, whether that's differences in counties and or differences in systems. I should say differences within systems or differences between systems. So those are recommendations that we have in terms of the second policy option. What is nice is that, from my perspective at least, is that a number of these things Minnesota has started. I'm hoping through our work, through I believe what will be my ongoing involvement, I'm hoping that what we can do is help raise those up and move them forward and get them completed and in place so that it is happening consistently across the state. Grace, I'll stop now.
Thanks, David. Comments or questions from the group about any of these recommendations or options? Yeah, Senator Rosen.
Yes, thank you, Grace. And thank you, David, for this. This is very good. The last bullet point, streamline a statewide process for people by a single agency. What does that single agency look like? Is it state?
No, I'm sorry.
Private?
Apologies. Let me clarify that. What we're saying is that if somebody is on supervision, then you have a process now in place that doesn't always get followed about how folks, if they're on probation in say 2 different places, or on supervision in 2 different places or 3, that can be rolled up to 1. But it's a bit of a cumbersome process. It's not always happening. And sometimes there are costs involved that are problematic. And so what we're saying is that somebody doesn't need to be supervised in multiple areas. So you want to roll that up. You want to have, if they're in Hennepin and Ramsey and Scott, you want them in one county. You want them to be supervised in one county. And so where is that? Likely it would be where they live, but again, to be figured out as we move forward. But don't have them on supervision in 3 different places. That it increases their confusion. It's a waste of resources. It increases the costs, potentially increases the failure, and it creates inconsistency potentially in terms of the stipulations of what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. There may be a reason that a stipulation from one type of offense needs to happen, but that can be rolled up as well. You don't need 3 different agents spending their time on this individual. And so when we say streamline the process, what we say is when somebody is on supervision in more than one place and or more than one system, let's figure out a way to streamline that so that they are being supervised in one place and by one supervisor and not multiple. That's all we meant by that. We weren't trying to choose a system.
Yeah, we'll tighten that language up, Senator. I think there's no more than one agency. Yeah, Kelly.
On the recommendations relating to conditions, so a number of years ago, the Judicial Council decreased the number of standard conditions for felonies to 10. So I'm wondering, when you're making this condition, does it mean that hasn't been implemented across the state and that we need to work on that? And then they also didn't address misdemeanors. So are you potentially saying there's an issue with the standard conditions at the misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor level?
I'm trying to think of how I want to say this. The reason that I think it needs to be explored is that what I have seen in a number of places in Minnesota is that special conditions are seen as standard conditions. And so what you have are individual determinations about this is always going to be there. So yes, the 10 might be there, but in this place, there's always 12. Or in this place, there's always whatever. And so the issue really is how do we promote what has already been developed? I would argue that 10 might actually be a couple too many anyway, but that's another discussion. How do we promote what's been developed? And how do we develop special conditions in a way that they are related to the specific criminogenic risk and need, as opposed to opinions about
Yeah. So can I ask you one more sort of follow-up to that? So is another way to say it also that it might be offense related? So like DWI always gets these 10 and domestic abuse always gets these 7, or, are you seeing that as well? Is that part of what we need to think through, where we need to look at that person who's been convicted of a DWI and say, okay, there's this minimal number that everybody gets. Now let's look at whether you have an alcohol problem, a substance use problem, and whether we need a special condition to help you address that. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the can of worms you've just opened and where I want to go with that. So Minnesota, I've mentioned this before. Minnesota defines things as chemical dependency, which is like So that happens, and what I think that naturally leads people to see it all one way. Let's just say that. In terms of domestic violence, Minnesota is not alone about this. We've done a terrible job around domestic violence, and we've done a terrible job in 2 ways. One, we've done a terrible job of holding folks who commit domestic violence accountable in the right way. 2, we've done a terrible job in actually disaggregating the individuals who commit it. And so we see them as all the same. And so they tend to get the same programming, which makes no sense, the same stipulations, which make no sense. And that is a real pattern. I did not delve down into the agencies to look at those subgroups. I'm telling you this, with 30 years of experience of looking at it, but I'm not, and I feel very confident that I will find that if I delve down into it in Minnesota. But to be fair, I did not try to get into those specific offense patterns when I was talking to folks.
Thanks, David. Kevin, Director Reese, Chair Reese.
All right, thank you. David, I got a question. Earlier, we were talking about this tool, the actual tool that we're going to be using, right? It's going to be validated. So the question I have is, who is validating this tool? Because one of my concerns is, so this is going to be the new parameter that we're going to use, that these folks come out, because we're using the tool. Best as humans, the best we know how to do is get a tool to put people in boxes and categorize them, right? And this tool is going to be validated. Who, by who? Who is this process? Who does this validation?
Well, that's something that you all are going to have to determine, right? Sometimes those validations are done by researchers within the correction system. Sometimes those tools are validated by universities who have specialists in risk and need. Sometimes you hire specialists from around the country. There's a handful of people who do this. The tools need to be validated across gender, across race, across ethnicity. Tools cannot make up for bias in the system. Let's be clear here. All right. Tools can act as a canary in the coal mine. If I find out that if you are Black in Scott County, and I'm picking counties out of my hat here, nothing personal about any county. If I find out if that in Scott County, it is much more likely that Black people are going to be rated high risk than in Hennepin County, then I'm going to want to be looking at what's going on, because I'm going to make an assumption. The reason that's happening isn't because Black people in Scott County are different than Black people in Hennepin County. I'm going to be assuming that I've got one of 2 problems. I have people doing the assessment incorrectly, or I have a system where it is more likely that a Black person is going to get nailed by law enforcement than a white person is going to. All right. So you've got 2 different issues. A tool can be accurately predictive and still skew where somebody from one race or another is going to have a higher risk. That's because of what's happening in the system. So you have to measure 2 things. You have to measure what are the factors that an individual has, and you have to measure what's going on in the system within which they live, where they live. You have to do both those things. So sorry, that was a long answer and a shameless plug. We are about to publish a set of guidelines on fairness, bias, and transparency in the use of risk and needs assessment, which will be coming out in the near future. And we would argue that these 13 guidelines must be followed when you are either validating an existing tool or creating a new tool. And that will be out in the next couple of months, very much in time for Minnesota to utilize it.
Thanks, David. Shameless plugs at the end. Shameless plugs at the end. Just kidding.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Because this process being transparent and a collaborative effort across all of these barriers that you said is really important. Because under this tool, we will be holding folks accountable. And if it was another thing that happened without consensus from community or feedback from community and actual folks who just want to impact, it would fail because folks won't believe in it. It would feel like there was another third-party institution that got this validation over my humanity, and it would just be the biases will show up. So thank you for allowing this to be a collaborative, transparent process, which gives it room for it to have community buy-in.
Thanks, Chair Reese. Judge Frisch.
Thank you very much. It's been really important for me to listen to these conversations over the last several meetings, just sort of mindful of my role, not as a policymaker, but as a judge, and hopefully to kind of give you some perspective about what happens when someone is placed on probation and they're not performing in a way that is productive in the community. The thing that I am concerned about is the conditions of probation are pronounced at sentencing. And so it's really important to think about the use of a validated tool and conferring with someone who's going to be placed on probation before sentencing occurs. So when we're talking about the use of a tool, I don't think it does any good to use the tool after somebody's been placed on probation, but it should be incorporated as part of a pre-sentence investigation report. Because just in my experience, judges rely very heavily on the recommendations of probation as to what conditions are appropriate for a particular person they're recommending be placed on probation. And I think that really does go to Chair Reese's point that we want to treat people as individuals. We want to meet people where they are. We don't want to over supervise them or impose additional conditions that aren't necessarily related to their offense or their particular needs. And we want to set people up for success and not put them in a position where we impose so many conditions or such onerous conditions where we're not balancing the need to change criminogenic behavior and have them succeed on probation. So just a timing issue, I think, is important to include as to when we do this assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Judge. I think this is something that could be addressed in the service standards and definitions on the pre-sentence investigation process. And I also think you touched on something important, which is as we push up consistent practices across the state, how do we time them right? How do we, consistently and equitably roll things out? And I really, after working in Minnesota for this while, I think we have a good group of folks to do that. David, I don't want to wholly cut you off, but at the sake of time, is it okay if I move to the next topic, which is, unless there are additional questions about this policy section? Thanks again, everyone, for your comments. Please post stuff in the chat, email, call us. We're available anytime if you have additional questions or as you sort of churn and think about what we're talking about, please reach out. And that, Judge Frisch, you actually set up a nice transition, which is how do we move from a supervision failure system to a supervision success and outcomes failure? How do we get people, how do we push the investment in Minnesota to the systems that help people succeed and ultimately get off supervision, but also do it successfully in a way that doesn't harm public safety and not push people to a system or prisons or jails where things are definitely more expensive. So the next section is really about how we hold people accountable, but how we hold them accountable to the things directly related to the crimes or offenses that are being committed. Thanks, David.
So the policy options here, in terms of policy option 3, if you will, the details. The first one I've already mentioned, which is the development of a statewide incentives and sanctions grid. And people may wonder, why do I harp on that? Because I do harp on it. A couple of things. One is certainly Minnesota utilizes sanctions. You have sanctions conferences. Officers informally use incentives. But again, Now it's based on each individual officer, or excuse me, agent's decision or skill level, et cetera, and that of their supervisors, of course, helping them. And it doesn't necessarily give people a range of options. And so one of the things that we have done in many states now is help folks develop these grids of both incentives and sanctions that give people menus of things that they can do, that they can choose from. And to sort of tie that to the degree of risk that the individual may hold in terms of recidivism or public safety risk, depending, and then also allow for sort of different levels in terms of the incentives and or the sanctions. And by sanctions, again, we don't mean prison necessarily, although or jail, but ultimately in some cases that may be required. What we're talking about is what are the things that we can do to intervene prior to having to go back to jail or to prison, which of course Minnesota works hard at trying to make sure it doesn't happen when not necessary. We're looking to sort of make that more consistent across the state throughout the 3 different delivery systems, and frankly within the delivery systems as well. And so that's why we're really talking about that. And by the way, incentives, lots of people talk about sanctions and incentives. I talk about incentives and sanctions. Incentives are the things that change behavior. Sanctions hold people accountable, but they're not that good at changing behavior. Incentives are much more effective in terms of changing behavior. And incentives might be as simple as verbal praise. We're not talking about, giving people new cars or anything like that, anything silly, right? But we're talking about rewarding people for moving along the path in the correct way. Additionally, we're talking about really looking at prioritizing resources according to risk and need so that those folks with greater supervision potential for supervision failure receive higher intensity interventions. I've noticed a bit of over-supervision occurring in different spots in Minnesota, and there are a couple of problems with that. Over-supervision of low-risk people increases their failure. And the other problem with that is that it takes away from really being able to spend the time that you want to spend with your higher risk individuals. I also want to be clear, even if you fixed that, folks don't have enough resources to be able to move it to higher risk folks. So if anybody has an idea of if we just fix A, then we can do B, I'm sorry, you still won't have enough folks that really do need more resources. One of the ways that we're looking at that is really looking at reducing the number of people in active supervision so that the resources can be better focused. Again, it won't solve the problem. It's one piece. And so part of what we're talking about in terms of recommendations is that if somebody has been on supervision for 2 years, this is felony, and they have complied, they've done all the things they're supposed to do, then you can drop them down. If it's misdemeanor after a year, as opposed to 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I was working in another state that will remain nameless that had the same level of intervention and supervision for this individual who had been compliant for 9 years, and there was absolutely no change. It was a tremendous waste of their resources and ultimately sort of makes clients feel very hopeless. Now, to be clear, if somebody is not doing what they need to be doing, if they are having challenges, if they are failing in different things, this is not a 2-year window where at 2 years you must do this no matter what. It's if people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, let's get them off of active supervision. Let's get them on administrative supervision. Let the officers spend the time with the people that really need that time to be spent. I keep saying officers, I'm sorry, in my state it's officers. Let the agents spend the time with the people that they really need to. And again, I can't emphasize enough that while this will help some, the shortages for supervision agents are so significant, this will not solve the problem of the shortages. And so I don't want anybody to misinterpret that. And then we're also suggesting the development of what's called a halfway back in some places caseload or revocation caseload. These are caseloads where you can move someone who's having tremendous difficulty and really needs more than that agent who has them can provide just because of time. And for up to 90 days, they can be on this very small specialized caseload that provides a lot of case management services, a lot of greater support and intervention, gets them stabilized, and then they go back to their regular unit. Obviously, this is assuming that their difficulties aren't things that are threatening community safety. That's not what we're looking at. But what we're looking at are people, particularly people who might have mental health needs, who might have a lapse with substance use issues, who might have some of those difficulties. It allows for those extra services or responses for them without maybe them losing their job because they're back in jail, without disrupting the family any further, without getting in the way of whatever other things that may be working for them or succeeding. How do we do that? And so it is a way to effectively lower the technical violation that an agent might have been doing for a reason that they were concerned about the individual. In other words, they were not to get the individual, but they felt like this was the only option because I don't have something else to do with them. This is a way to have something else to do with them. I will say that we started doing this in our state a few years ago where I live, and made a very significant difference, particularly for those folks with substance use difficulties in terms of improving outcomes for them. And then lastly, really talk about limiting the supervision of misdemeanor offenses that are not we're not talking about DWIs or domestic violence or sex crimes, stalking. You have a lot of those crimes and misdemeanors. We're talking about sort of those crimes that really aren't against a person, but are low-level misdemeanors and do not need really to be supervised on and on and on over a period of time. So really sort of limiting the supervision of those individuals. And with that, Grace, I will stop. I do see that Director Reese has his hand up.
Thanks, David. Director Reese.
Yeah, for sure. I just kind of wanted to harp on what David was talking about the incentive piece is what actually changes behavior. Incentive is a word that I had a conversation with the commission a few moons back. At this time, my name was still 219637. And I was talking to the commissioner. And at that time, I had been in prison like 14 something years. I had did every program inside of there. None of it mattered. So one of the words that we were using for the stuff that's actually already in place in the DOC, the programs to the case manager, from the capacity, from the staff and the programs, the part that can be free is to incentivize this place. This would be ground zero, because one of the things we're asking for our citizens that we incarcerate is that we're trying to give them a breeding ground to practice this civilized behavior, right? And how do they know they are doing it right, right? Unless you are incentivizing and encouraging them along the way. And I'm all about abolishing this entire system. But along the way, ground zero is going to be, particularly here in the state of Minnesota, because it's not happening that way, if the actual things that's in place will be incentivized, they will begin to matter. That's what a culture will shift. The culture will shift, right? Because it's urban tale. It's folks will begin to talk. The conversations will begin to be different. So that would vibrate for folks who's incarcerated, that's on probation, on parole, because they were actually seeing with their own eyes a change. They will actually see with their own merit, if I do this, a good thing happens for me. If we do that for folks is more likely to continue to practice and exercise that particular muscle once they are entering back into community. So nothing in particular, but I just want to harp really hard on the importance of incentivizing this. And that part is actually free. It's a choice. Now we're going to have to put the rest of the pieces together to make it all work, but we can choose the way in which we handle our incarcerated citizens while we're giving them this time away to get their mind right so they can come back to us. It would be sure great to encourage them along the way while they're doing it.
Thank you, Chair Reese. And I couldn't agree more. It's that shift from being people who are just holding people accountable to folks who are invested in change and the change that people are capable of that makes, that's actually going to make really the change from the ground. So thank you. Yeah, Mr. Troy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Kevin just talked about. And a thought that I had, and this is, I mean, I'm not in the field of corrections, and maybe this is just kind of like a crazy idea, but like when someone is preparing to be released from prison, because the reality is everybody that goes to prison, I mean, just a small few people are there for a really, really, really long time. Most people are going to be getting out. But, what is it that we can do to even have some of these conversations about trying to incentivize people to take some of those steps to prepare and ready themselves for reentry, right? That's just one thing I just want to raise, and I just feel like that's an intriguing thing. I have no idea what they do in the prison system for the last 30 days, 60 days, or the year, or whatever it might be, to think about that. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, that I just find that to be really intriguing, because it's like a black box for me. I have no idea what happens. And then the second piece that I wanted to talk about was, and it kind of goes to a little bit of what Kevin was talking about, this thinking about things not just from a negative, but also from a positive reward standpoint. I think what the first recommendation allows for potentially is to do certain things like dosage probation, right? Because I know that Washington County has been trying to do that, and I think they're really happy about just some of the things there. So I think that's a great concept. And if it is truly working around the country, from what I understand, it would be great to be able to encourage people to utilize those types of models. And then the last thing I just wanted to say too, and it might go to the prior section, but you use the word equity in the language. And I don't know that I can see it in the bottom recommendations, but I want to lift up this notion of procedural justice as well. And it ties into this section too, because it very fascinating for me is that, like, for instance, the Hawaii Hope program, where they utilized actual short durations of jail time, which are very predictable, and they had really better outcomes. And I think it was demonstrated here in the mainland by a number of pilot sites that did that work. But I just think that, I think some people debate whether or not it's the short durational use of jail that might be why that program is effective. But I also think there's another theme of Hawaii Hope, which is incorporating procedural justice. I mean, I find it very fascinating that people who are subject to the supervision under that type of program had the level of satisfaction was very high. And a part of it was because I think they were the whatever sanctions that they may have gotten were predictable, and they knew that these would be followed through on. So it kind of goes to this issue too. But I think this notion of procedural justice, about making sure that we're actually thinking about it from the perspective of those who are subject to the supervision, is, I think, really critical to our success. So I know that this committee hasn't delved deep into those perspectives, but I think that I just wanted to throw that out there, that I also think that we need to be asking the people who are subject to the supervision to tell us what it is that's going to help them be successful. And I think Kevin touched on a few things.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. I just want to call out that the revocation caseload is actually a replacement for short stints in jails. One of the things that we learned in Hope was that predicting and plan and being able to know your consequences is important, but also, as much as we can avoid jail, the revocation unit is a model that's worked really effectively. So it doesn't interrupt people's jobs or families or other things that are hard to restabilize upon reentry from jail or prison. Dr. Williams.
I was in some other place, and then John actually, that whole point about procedural justice is very important. I think it speaks to what Representative Moran was talking about in the beginning. When you can root out bias and you're thinking differently, I think this was Kevin's point as well, there's still this philosophical tension, and I think many of us picked this up in some of the communication we receive from people in community who obviously have been victims of crime, but are still asking this fundamental age-old question: what is the purpose of corrections? Is it for rehabilitation of the people who are being brought into the correction system? Hint to John's question about that last 30 to 90 days and what that represents in terms of reentry. Or is it about punishment and retribution for something? Or can it be both? the reality is, even treating people with the degree of humanity that Kevin talked about, where you're taking the time to do a satisfaction survey and being concerned about their experience within the correction system would be a noticeable change from the way that most people think about corrections today and the model that we use today. So I don't know that I wanted to elevate something that Kevin said, but I think John took me in a different place. I think that's one way that we can think very concretely about rooting out bias, is by ensuring there's that procedural justice and that people aren't seeing that wide variety that you noted in the African-American and Indigenous community in terms of sentencing. And then more importantly, I think we just get back to Kevin's bigger point about addressing in some very clear-cut way, what is the purpose of corrections? Just answering that question for the community in a way that at least people come to this and understand why we're talking about some practices that otherwise lead people to believe that, you're just adopting kind of a muddle-headed or liberal or insert descriptor here model, as opposed to, no, we're making a philosophical statement about rebuilding community.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Williams. And that was one of the original intents of the project in terms of, if Minnesota's goal is a commitment to supervision, then how do you invest in a supervision structure that actually gives breadth to the actual opportunity for change and a second chance, and does it in a way that's equitably or through procedural justice more well distributed in practice consistently throughout the state? So that it does play in here, and I'm glad that people are drawing that thread. It's important. Thank you. Co-Chair Reese.
Thank you. I want to go back and answer the question County Attorney Choya asked. Yes, currently now there is a reentry process. There are resources. You have a whole entire reentry process. But if you ask me, it's happening too late in incarceration. By the time you get to your last 90 days, you did all of the days before that, and there was no investment. So by the time you get to that place, you feel pressed, you feel stressed. It's not enough resources. The case manager is overworked. It's not enough time to prepare. That conversation about the last 90 days needs to happen on day one. It needs to be a process from day one. And there are currently resources and things that's in place. And we need to look at, are we doing best as we possibly can with the resources that's in place? I would say no, because it needs to start way before 60 to 90 days. By that time, it's already been reaffirmed to you that you don't matter to community because you've been not a part of the human family all of this time. It already been confirmed to you, no matter what programs I've done inside of here, any of this stuff inside of here, when I get out, I'm going to still have all of these barriers, right? It's already been confirmed to you. So that by the time you're at your last 90 days, you're just terrified trying to get whatever you can from the system, but you have this feeling of knowing you're going to have to beat the whole system, versus if it was taking place at day one, by the time you get to that place, you have actually felt like, well, this particular institution in the state actually helped me, right? If we're asking about the purposes of incarceration, folks should be able to leave and say, dang, this institution helped me. No one feels that way.
Thank you, Chair Reese. I have consistently heard that. And I think that's actually a nice transition into something which you're going to say, Grace, this is a stretch, but it's a little bit of a stretch, but we're going to get there, which is one of the recommendations is a quality assurance unit. And part of what we're looking at is how does the state invest in a statewide unit of people that, in partnership with the Association of Minnesota Counties, with MACAC, with CPO, to consistently do quality assurance, coaching, training, development, and meaningfully invest in how we are preparing agents across the state to work with people. And the thread that you helped me draw, Co-Chair Reese, is the one about, I don't think it hurts us to pull that into looking at the systems that are happening, so that upon reentry, what's happening in the programming exclusively is consistent with the programming that's happening outside, to make sure that you're receiving people that are getting similar quality of message, similar quality of programming, similar quality of treatment. But the goal is that across the supervision systems, whether DOC, whether CCA, whether CPO, that there would be a meaningful investment into quality assurance and developing the right programs that work, training and coaching that works, and really protecting that state investment so that people are prepared to work with folks on supervision. I raced through option 4. I'm going to going to lean in here to option 5, and then I'm going to skip over to the state investment, knowing that we left a couple of Easter eggs on behavioral health. I'm going to mention victims. We do have some public testimony, so I want to be respectful of the time that constituents gave and make sure at 4 o'clock that we have room for that. But please know that I do this saying that we're here, we will talk to you. We are, and not a decision is not being made today. We are developing a report, and we're churning through all these options that we're talking about. So the conversation does not end here or today. We pointed out to both to folks on this group over the past couple of meetings that there are racial disparities in the supervision system in Minnesota. We saw this pretty distinctly in the tribal populations or Native American populations in Minnesota. We also see this in Black populations in Minnesota. We showed you the data that our team looked at, and we talked a little bit about the need for, not only because of the recommendation of the legislation that helped support this work in this report, but also just because tribal nations are independent governments in Minnesota, and there is a need to make sure that all governments in Minnesota, be it state, county, or tribal, have access to the supervision system that works best for the public safety of their population. If I haven't said it recently, I will say the purpose of this project is to make sure that counties, tribes, and the state has options, and we're not making public safety decisions based on budget. We're making it based on the needs of our communities and the folks that we're working with. So the policy options that are new and unique are really to make sure that tribes have the same supervision options as other governments in Minnesota. This requires much more planning and preparation and work with the tribes. So we're not under any false notions that this is ready to go July 1, but we do think the investment needs to be here for tribes starting July 1. The second is to promote diverse corrections and treatment workforces. When we talk about the formula, you're going to hear me talk about investing in workforce and FTE specifically when working with the felony supervision population. This is a long-term goal. We're not going to turn the light on and suddenly thousands of people are going to want to be supervision officers. But we do know that if we don't invest and promote and build these industries up, these work industries up, and find the change agents that want to work with people, then we're going to still be a day late and a dollar short in making sure that we have the appropriate resources. I really do want to point out something that David said, something that Co-Chair Reese said, something Dr. Williams said, something Representative Moran said, which is when you equitably start implementing these practices, whether it's the supervision standards and definitions, whether it's the sanctions and grid, whether it's the step down to administrative probation, these are the things that have a direct impact on the disproportionate representation of folks and people of color in Minnesota who are on supervision. So with intentionality, these are recommendations that we're making, not only because it makes it better for everyone on supervision, but we predict an impact, and research has supported that these are measures that when equitably, consistently, and effectively implemented, that they will have an impact. And that's a goal. That's something that we know Minnesotans want to focus on, and I know it's important to this council. Comments or questions about quality assurance or racial equity efforts as specific to these policy options for community corrections in Minnesota, as I stutter. All right. Feel free to put that little emoji hand up if you need to, but I want to really talk about the state investment. Our team did our best job that we could in trying to make our formula ideas clean and clear, but I am more than happy to get on the phone and talk to people about a couple of principles. For 2022, we are recommending an initial state investment into community corrections in Minnesota. The initial investment is based on a single funding formula, so that, again, counties and tribes and local jurisdictions are making supervision system decisions based on the public safety and other needs of their community and not on the bottom line or budget. There's three principles for the 2022 investment. The one is that regardless of supervision system, counties and tribes should have the capacity, and DOC should have the capacity to implement effective community supervision for all adults and juveniles. This capacity place that I talked about earlier is where we also get the flexibility to be a little more creative. This is where we're working in coordination, where we're being more responsive to the unique needs, right? Because we're not just pinning the formula on a person, we're pinning it to a whole system and investment in making community corrections work best in Minnesota. The 2022 investment, and if you think back to the data that we showed you, which I mean, all the thousands of slides, right? But let me just remind you that the place we're really trying to make a dent is in the revocation of folks on felony supervision. And we're trying to increase the success rates of people on felony supervision. Because of this, the 2022 investment, we're recommending that there is an investment in workforce and an investment in people to help with supervision and felony supervision specifically. The other principle that's important to just underscore is that anything that we're talking about includes a shared responsibility between counties and states. The counties have shouldered an investment in supervision. I don't think anyone would disagree with me on that. And we were asking the state to also invest so that it's shared. It's not an unfunded mandate, that we have equal investment in the success of the supervision system, and that we have equitable and effective practices across the state. The formula is spelled out a little bit lower. That's just for fiscal year 2022. Again, so there's a part one and there's a part two. But Carl, did you come off mute to help me out with something?
No, sorry, that was an accident.
Okay.
Very good.
Sweet, thanks. Good reassurance. You can see the actual formula, which is essentially a base investment plus that base investment is made up of three parts. One, just a flat dollar investment, which is about 2 FTE per county or tribe. The second part is an additional add-on for population. We're accounting for volume, but we're also accounting for geography or the rural nature or the space that people have to travel, the difficulty people have accessing resources in the remote and rural areas of Minnesota. So that's your base. That's the part one of your 2022 formula. The part two is that FTE and FTE for folks on supervision. We pulled your CCA, CPO, and DOC counties. We found out how many FTEs they had, and we looked at the assessed needs of folks in your current population when the data was available, and we applied it to your current felony population by the survey data, and that's how we got the estimate. It's a lot of information. You can sit on it. It'll keep you up tonight. It kept me up. But you can hit me up if you want to talk through that a little bit more. But that's your 2022 investment. That lays the groundwork for a single funding formula that is based on two phases again. Your phase one is that base investment. So we're replicating the 2022 formula, which is at least 2 FTEs, a little addition for population, and a little addition for geography. That's your base investment are made up of those three components. And the second will be the results of the capitated rate work that will happen between July 1 and October, November, December to make sure that we have what we need for the best budget decisions. But it's a twist on what we learned in Oregon, what we learned in Pennsylvania. It's got a little Minnesota flair in supporting the capacity and not just being reliant on who's supervision in order to make supervision decisions. That gives us 7 minutes for questions in order to be respectful of the people who called in to do personal testimony. But so I'm gonna, please don't be cranky if I cut you off at 7 minutes. I promise to make it up for you later as long as you want. So Jason, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I really do appreciate this approach. There's so much of these recommendations that I really applaud and I think there's going to be a lot of support for. I love the notion of agencies and counties being able to make their decision not based on the funding formula or what's the financially makes the most sense for them, but what's the best, local approach and local control and whatnot. Having said that, as I look at what's being proposed to generate that capitated rate, I certainly applaud the emphasis on risk level, right? Higher risk clients take higher levels of intervention. And then at the very bottom of the paragraph, right before in red, where it says single funding formula principles, it says with felony probation being more heavily weighted. And then I go bonkers in my mind because I think, man, I've got I've got 5 adult gross misdemeanor caseloads. And in those, there's some really high risk folks. And those are caseloads in the hundreds, 120. The amount of work that my agents do there take the amount of work it takes. And because they're only these lowly gross misdemeanors, we're going to get a lower rate of reimbursement. Not only does that hurt me and make me want to cry inside, it also makes me and others kind of go, well, if we got to go where the bread's at, maybe we need to look at a different delivery system. And that's what we're trying to avoid doing. So that's all I'll say.
Nobody likes to make you cry, Jason. I just want to add that that's the 2022 formula and not necessarily the 2023 or 2024. Though we are weighting towards felony folks in 2022 and then relying on the capitated rate, the weighted caseload survey to set those by risk, by offense, from misdemeanor to intensive supervised release to determine what those reimbursement rates should be. So just to be really clear. Thanks, Jason. CJ.
Jason knew I was going to jump in there, right?
I'm sure he did.
I guess I would say we talk about in this space often about risk assessments and risk levels. And part of, I think, David's point in saying you need to be talking about the same things when you say high risk is this sometimes disagreement between Jason and I sort of as proxies for our delivery systems, right? That I think we all have to agree on when we say high risk to do what exactly? Because those gross misdemeanors might indeed be high risk. The question is high risk to do what? And I think that's part of, again, what is the risk we're willing to assume? What is the thing that we hope we're trying to prevent? And a little bit to the, what is it that we want corrections to do in the state of Minnesota? So I don't want to discount Jason's point that he's dealing with high risk folks. And I think he's doing risk assessments, right? I know how Jason's doing his business. I'm not suggesting that those folks are not high risk in his world. I think it is a question for all of us, though, to go, all right, high risk to do what? And which high risk do we really want to focus on? Is it the folks who are high risk to commit another DWI? Maybe it is, right? There's a lot of risk associated with DWI and the collateral consequences of what can happen in those cases. And that matters, and we can't ignore it, and we have to pay attention to it. And it might need a great deal of resources because we're dealing with someone who potentially has substance use issues around alcohol or something else, right? DWI isn't necessarily just an alcohol-related potential issue. And also, as I sit in Hennepin County and have people from all kinds of sides talking to me about the risk to reoffend for carjacking, particularly around our juvenile offenders, what about those two risk levels when we talk about high risk in both cases? Where are the differences and where are the similarities? And I think so being really clear about saying when we talk about capitated rate, it is high risk to do what exactly?
Yeah, thanks, CJ. Mr. Troy.
I know we're short on time, so I'm going to try to speak as fast as I can, but it seems to me that a lot of the money is going to be reinvested back into the correctional probation infrastructure of how we have always done things. And I wonder if there's any way that we could be also, from an innovative standpoint, to carve out some of these funds as a part of grants to fund some of the innovative things that are happening. So I point to southwestern Minnesota, in the area of Yellow Medicine County and the counties that surround that, but they have dramatically reduced their out-of-home placement costs and have gotten better outcomes for families and their child protection systems. I think that there are things that could also be funded. For instance, we need to be thinking about models that don't just have correctional supervision where we've done it the same way. Why can't correctional probation agents work in line, in tandem with community partners like we've been doing. Police have now recognized in my community that when they do some of the policing, it's great to partner with community ambassadors and other folks to get some of the issues resolved around livability in downtown. So I just wanted to make sure that we're also thinking about funding community, number one, and then number two, thinking about innovative things that also, and by the way, what's going on in Yellow Medicine County is relying heavily on their own community to help solve these issues. And so let's not lose sight of the fact that some of our best solutions, I think, are actually embedded in our people, the people that we all work for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Choi. And please, everyone, on page 11 or 12, there's some talk about some initial investments we had considered that were in the governor's budget yesterday that we support that speak more to what you're talking about directly. So thank you. Yeah, Co-Chair Reese and then Chairman Dupuis.
Just quick, I want to go back to what Catherine said, Catherine Johnson. Thank you so much for saying that. I think that one of the ways in which this is happening is through language. Language is really powerful, right? High risk, low risk is just part of my lexicon. I've been involved in the system using terms like this, but I never thought to ask the question, high risk for what? Part of my recommendations is we should have to answer that question or don't ask it or don't say it. It either should say high risk to do X, Y, Z, so we can all live in the same world, but this label is on this person. They have a high risk to do X, Y, or Z. There's a metric after that. Either that high risk is going to be true or false. There's a metric to follow after that as well, too. Either we should have it on there or we should change the language that we are using when we are saying folks are high risk or low risk to do what. Thank you for that, Captain.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Chairman Dupuis, sorry for mispronouncing.
No, that's fine. I just want to thank everybody for the comments, and it really kind of sparked up a thought process, especially with Catherine, like you said, Chair Reese, and Jason. We talk about risk or high risk. I want to say this as only as an Indigenous or Anishinaabe perspective. And Mr. Choi, you kind of hit the nail on the head at that point as we look at it. We look at ourselves as a communal people. So when I ask myself, what does high risk mean? If we're looking at the individual on our perspective only, on Indigenous side, then I think we lose sight of the real problem. And the real problem is kind of what Mr. Choi was going at, is a communal thing. So if we are at a high risk community, which we are, and the numbers show that in every statistic, we're higher than everybody else, no matter what it is, then we have to take a look at, if it's a high risk community, I want to go back to the point that was talked about a little earlier, and everybody's gone over it a couple of times. If we need to find out what is the purpose of DLC, then we need to find out what was the true purpose of release and going back into the community. Then also, we need to redefine, or what was the purpose of probation? Because if we don't define them and their purposes, then I believe as an Indigenous piece only, that if we attack the principle of high risk as an individual, we lose sight of everything that Mr. Choi was talking about at that point in time. And it has to be a collective. How do we get to that point? I think that individual communities can work together as much as they possibly can. I'm kind of worried about the budget piece again, and I kind of went over that before. If we look at it statistically, if we make up only 1% of the population in the state of Minnesota, I don't see how that budget or that principle is going to become more equity on the end with the Indigenous people. Just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to reach out to you later because I would like to learn more about what might work because we do have that base investment, but you raise an important thing. So thank you. An important investment question. I love the big questions in the philosophy, and I have talked repeatedly this week about moving 87 counties in Minnesota at the same pace is no small feat. And I appreciate really the work of this group and the work of the folks who have done all the work up until now, till you all had the chance to meet. I want to please invite Amy Zener to join us. She's going to be our first testifier. And thanks, Council, for moving through your comments so we could make space for folks to participate. Amy, are you able to? Just want to make sure you can hear us because I know you've been in the waiting room. Amy, are you available?
This is Anne.
Maybe I said your name wrong. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Anne. Please, I apologize. My deep apologies. Please go. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for allowing me to testify and tell my story today. My name is Ann Zehner, and my life changed on December 2nd of 2021. In the time that it's going to take for me to speak to you today, I went from being a happy, independent homeowner to a victim of violent crime. Having 2 juveniles enter my home armed with a handgun and assault rifle was a surreal and terrifying experience. Since the assault, the robbery, and having my life threatened, I've learned a great deal about my attacker and our justice system. I know that I'm lucky to be one of those with a successful investigation that's apprehended at least one suspect. I'm among 25% of those who will see a measure of justice. And for that, I am grateful to the Minneapolis Police Department and my investigator and my prosecutor. Unfortunately, I've also learned that there are a few consequences for juvenile offenders. Most often they're arrested, temporarily detained, and released back onto the street to reoffend. They know this. And this is why we're seeing the spike what we do. There are no consequences. Perhaps one of the most disturbing things from my ordeal is learning of my offender's violent juvenile past. At 17 years old, he's done things that are most often attributed to adults. And I feel lucky to be alive. At the time of my armed home invasion, the juvenile entered my home with an assault rifle, and he had zero worry about what the system would do or what his consequences would be for reoffending, as he was already on probation for other offenses and on electronic home monitoring when he burst through my door. The existing guidelines and attempts to reform certain young people are clearly not working. As long as there are no consequences for reoffending, things will escalate and there will be more victims and the violence will continue. While I do believe in intervention early and often, we must address the fact that there's a new variant of juvenile offender out there, and they're dangerous. Without updated sentencing guidelines or stringent requirements for probation, I predict that things are only going to be worse. Please reopen juvenile detention facilities that were scheduled to close. Staff them with personnel that can redirect their path and to improve their choices. I realize that funding and also just simply finding personnel to do this could be a challenge, but perhaps we tap into our colleges, our universities, our junior college systems, young people who want to get involved in social work or psychology. Let's pay their tuition. Let's compensate them. Let's get them college credit to intervene and to be a part of this. Perhaps this even has the effect of peer-to-peer influence. And in the case of repeat violent offenders, we need to just simply create stricter sentencing guidelines that will take them off our streets. Our communities deserve better, and we should not have to suffer in the interim. The time for change is now.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for joining us today and for your testimony. I appreciate it. Gina, are you available? We'd like to queue you up next. You have 3 minutes, Gina.
Thanks, Grace. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Senator Rosen and Senator Marty and Representative Moran and co-chair Reese, Kevin, hi, everybody. I just want to say thank you and for the hard work that you're doing. I know this is really hard work, and to the Council of State Governments. My first trip to prison, I was 23 years old and had a 3-year-old and a really serious IV meth addiction and a lot of past trauma. You know, I won't get into a ton of that, but I was definitely somebody that our community was mad at and not afraid of. I had 13 felony convictions by the time I was 30, all for drug convictions and check forgery and financial transaction card fraud, all crimes that I committed for to get drugs, and those crimes were terrible for the victims of those crimes. I don't mean to make light of them at all, but but I didn't get help I didn't really get the help that I needed. The system that it was back then was a system of family separation. Every time I would go to treatment, they would separate me from my daughter, and she would be with my mom, and then I would get out, and our whole system, I guess, the thing that I would say about that, whether it's revocations or corrections, the funding associated with these systems is based around family separation. When we go to treatment, even coordinated entry for our families is shelters, sober housing, all of it is around family separation. And that makes it really hard. At the end of all of that, I did end up losing my kids because I couldn't stay sober because of my past trauma. My identity will never be, Kevin talked about that, my identity will never be 186179, because that's not the person that I am anymore. And so I liked what Dr. Williams said about making sure that all of this work that we do is community centered. My first time that I went to prison, I was 23 years old, and I went for 1/10 of a gram of methamphetamines because I couldn't stay sober, and I got revocated 3 times, and they sent me to prison. And that time I went to prison, I actually got assaulted by another broken woman who had been there a really long time. And that stuck with me. And the shame of that just perpetuated that. And I don't know that I was somebody that probably should have went to prison that very first time. The other point I just want to make is in my work with clients, depending on their judicial district, so their geography and the color of their skin, and not the content of their character or their hard work, depends on whether they get released from supervision. Gets released from supervision early. And I've watched this over and over and over again over the years. And so having some kind of system where it's even and based on incentives seems right, and not the bias of agents and systems, because it really depends on which county you're in, whether the hard work someone's done on probation gets taken into consideration. Some of them say half. Hennepin County does it based on whether they're doing well or not. And you guys are talking about, dropping them down to inactive supervision or whatever. And, that's fine, except for then things like pardons and other stuff like that doesn't even start until after you've been off supervision. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate all of you. And thanks for the time.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate your testimony. Lisa Walker, you have 3 minutes. Are you able to hear, and can we see your face? Lisa, can you hear me? There you are. Is it Hannah? I have Lisa. I'm so sorry.
No, that's my daughter's name. I couldn't figure out how to change it.
That's all right. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Co-Chair Rosen, Co-Chair Reese, members of the committee, thank you for your time. I come to you today as a victim of crime in Minneapolis. I'm speaking to you today also on behalf of my 21-year-old daughter. On September 3rd, our lives were forever changed when 3 men entered our home in Southeast Como, a beautiful community of elder residents, young families, and university students. These 3 men held us at gunpoint, threatened to kill us, robbed us, and stole my car. What these 3 men stole from us that evening, no amount of money could ever replace. They stole my 21-year-old aspiring 4.0 University of Minnesota student's confidence and replaced it with fear and sleepless nights. 146 sleepless nights, to be exact. Her PTSD from a gun barrel being pressed into her head is so severe, she has had to withdraw from in-person classes, unable to return to campus or sleep in our home. While she struggles to rebuild and regain her strength, I am here today to share some details of our situation. Roughly 6 hours after our home invasion, a 20-year-old felon on parole for a similar crime was apprehended in my vehicle due to a multi-agency effort. That individual was released from jail with no charges. Unbeknownst to me, while he was being released, I had contacted his parole office of record in Mankato. I was trying to educate myself, having never experienced a crime, on how this world worked. I was told that day they did not even know he had been arrested. How can that be? A felon on parole, arrested for a felony flee in 2 counties. Why was his parole officer not notified of his arrest? Could they not have held him on a parole violation in order to enable the completely strapped Minneapolis Police Department more time to collect the necessary evidence linking him to the home invasion? Where do these facts fall when his address is now listed in Minneapolis? Did he slip through the cracks? A known gang member on parole from another city, now residing in Minneapolis. When there are repeat offenders of violent crimes involving a gun, why is there not a better system to bolster the cooperation of different agencies to support one another, especially in these trying times of the lack of manpower within the police departments to collect evidence to effectively charge these criminals? It has been widely stated that repeat offenders know exactly how to use the system. They operate on a risk-reward basis. Who is watching these serious reoffenders? Why has Minnesota become a revolving door of crime while fingers get pointed back and forth at who's to blame? All the while, crime is skyrocketing. Now Minnesota has plans to close Hennepin County Juvenile Detention. Where will the serious offenders go? Where is the incentive to not commit another serious offense? One of these 3 men that forever changed our lives was a juvenile when he committed his first offense, and yet his gun charge was dismissed. 2 years later, he's back on the streets, free to put the barrel of his gun against my daughter's forehead and threaten to kill her. Now, he's been released again. Who will he violate next? Has he already? Social programs are, of course, critical. My husband is a board member for Genesis Works, a company committed to providing high schoolers in impoverished communities opportunities through mentorship and employment. Getting to these kids early is the key. Prison is not always the answer in many scenarios, and I do believe programs that teach job skills and trades and all that goes into helping someone become a contributing member of society. But without serious consequences and incentives to not commit the crime goes on. Our case has been an example of dead ends and no answers, unlike anything I could have ever imagined. I've seen finger pointing amongst all of the agencies, more than I could have even imagined. Bottom line, crimes have skyrocketed. Minnesota is hurting more than ever before. My daughter is hurting. I am hurting. But you know who isn't hurting? That 20-year-old, the one with the gun, who pointed it in my daughter's forehead. His supervision did not work. Why? Why is he not prevented from repeating his criminal behavior? We are only one story. How many more are out there like ours? I want to thank you today for allowing me to be here, and I appreciate all of your efforts.
Lisa, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate it. Carly Stark. Thank you, Carly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Stark.
I am the executive director of the Minnesota Association of Community Corrections Act Counties, also known as MACAC. And I'm also a policy analyst for the Association of Minnesota Counties. And before I start talking about the Justice Reinvestment Program, I want to give you a little bit of my background. Most people who know me know that I used to be a public defender. But before that, I actually represented victims of domestic abuse in custody cases, harassment restraining orders, orders for protection. So I have represented individuals on both sides of the criminal justice system. And that is what brought me to my work in community corrections. I have always felt that the best way to protect victims once a crime has already been committed is to help someone never commit a criminal act again. So that's, and I see probation when following evidence and having fidelity to evidence-based practices as a place where there's the most potential to change lives so that there's no longer re-victimization. So the Association of Minnesota Counties and MACAC actually asked for the Justice Reinvestment Initiative to start in 2015. It did not start then. And then in 2019, I started working on it when I started in this position. So I have been calling people. I have been driving all over the state because I think that the underfunding of our probation system is part of the reason why people are falling through the cracks. In order to do evidence-based practices, you have to have time to do that. And without the proper employees and the proper training and the proper quality insurance, you're not going to be able to do that. And it's going to just, the same things are going to be happening over and over. And that's not to say that there aren't parts of the criminal justice system that are broken, that play into some of the disparities that happen on probation. I mean, I don't want to ignore that fact because those are there and we are trying to figure out how to decrease the disparities, how to ensure that implicit bias doesn't drive our decisions. But when we're underfunded and understaffed and not able to spend time talking to clients, we're just going to keep having these issues. So we think part of the way to change that is to change the funding structure, because right now the state has to make decisions first about funding the prisons, second about funding their own employees, and then third, they can then think of the other systems, which is the counties. And what people don't realize is that the counties supervise 83% of people on supervision. So legislators think that they are funding the whole system, but they aren't. So basically, like, I have so many things that I want to say, and I just don't have enough time to say them. But I think that everything people have been saying all fits together. And though it doesn't solve all the problems, I think that this will solve some problems and move us forward in Minnesota. I believe that personally and as part of my job advocating for people. So thanks for letting me be here and say my little piece.
Thank you, Carly. I appreciate your testimony. Midge Christensen. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Midge Christensen. I'm the director in 6 West Corrections, which is Chippewa, Yellow Medicine, Lac Pearl, and Swift counties. I'm also a member of MACAC. Just a couple of things I wanted to add today, and I just appreciate this conversation back and forth about what is best for Minnesota as a state overall. Because from a statewide perspective, the public and victims and clients all have a right to the best supervision system possible, right? In that system, the outcomes desired by those differing groups are not incompatible and they're not mutually exclusive, right? So safety is important to everybody. Equal and uniform access to services that help clients meet their needs and effectively change their lives, everybody wants that. Fair treatment that does not lead to bias or further reinforce bias, that's something that everybody in the state wants. Accountability that is handled the same way around the state and effectively, everybody wants that. So within this context, it's absolutely imperative that this group keeps sight of the fact that a structure and a process has to be put in place that determines funding need and funding distribution in an impartial, in a fair, in an equitable, and a transparent manner. So the funding by geography that's been happening, the funding that is influenced by one entity or another entity and does not consider the statewide need and statewide distribution, that is what's gotten us to the mess that we're in today. And this is our opportunity as a state to fix that going forward and make sure that we don't have creep back. So 10 years from now, we're all sitting around scratching our heads going, those were really nice 20 different studies that were done that Carl Reynolds got to take a look at. But why hasn't any of this been implemented and why are we in this mess? Today is the day that we fix that. One other thing that I wanted to mention just in closing, we haven't had a lot of time to talk about the tribal piece of this, but that is a very important and very exciting thing to bring to Minnesota. That tribes would have the unique ability to consider their situation, what is best for their citizens, and to come up with their own individualized methods of attacking things that are problematic in their own backyard, just as counties do. That is key in this. And so I just want to support that concept, and that from MACAC, we support that concept and the funding that goes along with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Midge, and thank you for your testimony. Today has been a great conversation, and it's only the first. I'm gonna pause. Representative Novotny, happy to hear from you today.
Too many buttons to turn off here. Hey, I have one question about the funding stream, and it's kind of piggybacking on what testifier Christensen just was talking about, and equity and having streams that are reliable. Has there been any examination by the people putting this study together into isolating the funding streams? By that I mean, is there any, right now everything comes through DOC, is there any look at isolating that from DOC to keep them reliable and keep, for lack of a better term, less hands in the pot? A cleaner line of funding from the state to the counties that are doing the work?
We have sort of explored that philosophically, Representative Novotny. One of the pieces that I've heard pretty consistently throughout the process is like, how do you get the quality assurance? How do you get the monitoring? How do you get the regulation of an 87 plus 11 tribe supervision system? We do know that there are some mechanisms, they're pretty untraditional, where through a different branch of the government. But the piece I can just tell you from, as the person at the Justice Center who's been involved in this process, I know one thing I've heard really consistently is that I have heard counties talk about, and I've heard the DOC talk about wanting to become a true statewide system that is coordinated between the state and the counties and find the balance. And to me, and I don't know, Carl, if you would like to offer this, I don't think we saw a practical way to do that without the involvement of a state agency with state resources. And I'm not sure it serves the state of Minnesota to do that, honestly and directly. I don't know if you would add to that, Carl.
Not really. I mean, I think there has to be, the legislature has to appropriate money to somebody. And I don't think it would be suitable in any state for that appropriation to be just going straight out without going to a state agency in between. Certainly in most states, including the states that we've looked at, I guess Pennsylvania is the only exception, where the Department of Corrections is one agency and the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency is a separate agency that handles funding to the probation system, but they're the exception. And in most states, the Department of Corrections has a more global role, either doing all the supervision or doing their own supervision plus channeling funding. So Minnesota is not an outlier in that regard.
would it be possible to be able to do supervision without handling the money?
It would be awkward, I think, for one agency to be getting the money for another agency's supervision. So unless you're going to bifurcate the streams and give money to DOC for what they do, and then give the money to some new agency to do the rest of the system, I'm not sure how that could work.
Do you know of any states that do that, or?
Well, I think, again, Pennsylvania might be an example there.
Okay.
A terrible example in terms of the amount of money that the state puts into it. It's just pitiful how much the state in Pennsylvania has invested in probation. But the structure of what they're doing is certainly different than Minnesota with the two different agencies. Commissioner.
Thank you.
I just think it's really important that we're aware too that the system here is built on the fact that counties have choice. And Community Corrections Act 1971, I think, was when that passed, and there was at that point in time statutorily a commitment that the state would bear the full responsibility for felony supervision across the state, and 50% for the CPO counties. And I think that this is an important context to remember, because what ends up happening is what occurs and is that when you have three different funding mechanisms, 50% for CPO, a formula that's based for CCA, and the DOC largely funded on increases, largely on the basis of contract negotiations for employee salaries, you can see how ultimately along the way, there's going to be a divide. And so one of the goals, I think, of this whole process was to think about what is an equitable system of trying to think about how we fund it across the board, so you don't set up these divisions with fundamentally different funding mechanisms that create the challenges that we find ourselves in and have for the past 40 years.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, Senator Marty.
Just a real brief comment on that. I'm not sure if there's a tilt towards Department of Corrections, it's not that legislature that is because Department of Corrections got their hands in there trying to grab more money. But I think it's more just the way that when we're doing appropriations, it's kind of, well, we got to take care of the state stuff. And of course, we're going to take care of the counties too. But whether it's what we do in school funding commitments for special ed, or what we do in higher ed funding commitments, what we do in probation commitments, it doesn't always live up to what's promised. I think there was a comment about that earlier. And so it's kind of like, well, if we don't fund it, the counties can pick up the tab. Yeah, it's not really super fair, but it's not our problem in a sense. I think that's just generally the human mindset, what we're facing. And so if there is an inequity there, but that's why this is so important to figure out what a good formula is.
Thank you, Senator. CJ, and then I just want to, after CJ, I'll check in with Chair Reese and Chair Rosen before another testifier. Go ahead, CJ.
Thanks, Grace. I guess I just want to say, as we have this funding conversation, we talk about, okay, let's make sure that the DOC has what they need for their prison system first and for their supervision staff second, and then we go to the counties. I think there is some truth to that. We've heard in the last several days lots of proposals about adding money at the front end of the system, right? Supporting law enforcement in ways that make sense right now with the lack of law enforcement personnel that we have. It's impacting investigations, some of those kinds of spaces, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think what I like to think of our system is that front door is important and it matters and we have to fund it. But the house matters too. And so does the back door. And when I left law enforcement, for those of you that don't know, I spent 22 years as a Minneapolis police officer. When I left law enforcement, people asked me repeatedly, why'd you do that, CJ? Why did you leave law enforcement? And I told people the truth. It's because I got tired of dropping people at the front door of the justice system and not being able to help them walk back out. And if what we focus on from a funding lens is the front door and the facade of the front of the house, and we focus on the prisons, which is just before that back door, it's the back part of that house, and the screen door is falling off, we're in trouble. And I encourage people to think of the system in that way because it matters at every single stage. If you want that house to stand, you have to take care of every piece of that house. And that includes probation and community supervision. It includes our law enforcement partners. It includes the courts. It includes all of those things, but you have to do it in a way that actually supports the work that we're asking people to do, which hasn't necessarily been the case in Minnesota on the corrections side of the equation for quite some time.
Thank you, CJ. Please reach out to us. Please ask us questions about the policy options. We're available. We're here. Thank you for your time and comments today. Chair Reese, the floor is yours. And then I think Chair Rosen, you're closing us out.
All right, thank you. First, I just want to send love and grace and solidarity to everyone who came and testified today. Thank you all for your courage, for sharing your stories and how that impacts us all. It matters. It absolutely matters. And what happened to you all, what tragedies, it shouldn't be that way. You shouldn't feel that way. Your children shouldn't be afraid. You shouldn't be afraid to be in your home. That is not the world that I want to live in. But the answer is not to go back to things that we did before. Hopefully, the solution is something ahead of us. So I just want to send you all so much respect for coming to share your story here today and to make sure that that is added to this conversation when we're talking about public safety. It's been an honor to serve as co-chair, part of this council, super committed to this project through and beyond, but just thank you all for sharing y'all testimony today. Really landed with me, holding y'all peace and solidarity.
And thank you, Chair Reese. That's very well said. And I too would like to express my sympathy for your loss. I thought you were at a fun rally. This is a very sobering and sad rally, so my apologies for that. And I too want to thank so much the victims and the testifiers that came. I can't imagine what you've gone through, but this is why we're meeting. This is the intent of making our world better, for sure. Mitch Christensen, you couldn't have said it any better. And this is why I said yes to co-chairing this meeting with my fellow colleagues here, is because of your comments about a structure that is fair, transparent, and equitable. I'm chair of finance, and we have to look at a system that makes investments in the upstream to make a difference downstream or in that door that you're going through. So I know that I don't want to steal any of Grace's comments, but I believe we are going to have 2 more meetings in February. And then at that time, myself and my colleagues, legislators here, we're going to have to buckle up because we've got February forecast coming in and we've got some other commitments. But this is definitely the information that was given to us today. We'll be able to really continue this conversation, have more testimony if necessary. And I do believe there was some dates that have been batted around a little bit. Grace or Michelle, can you help me out with that?
Yeah, we're looking at February 11th and February 18th. We'll send around a poll. We tried to stick to Fridays because of the legislative schedule in February, and we will do our best to accommodate around the same time as appeared to work for folks, but you'll hear from myself, Michelle, or it won't be me, I'm lying. It will be Michelle or Madeline here in the next couple of days. So I appreciate that. Please keep on the look for it. And thanks, Chair Rosen.
And also, we do have the report, as I mentioned, this Friday. It will fulfill the executive order's requirements, but anything else beyond that, we have to continue this conversation. So there are no further comments. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.